this part doesn't show up. So now you have now you're ready to color. So we have the sketch layer. I'm gonna group property and rename this as the sketch. You have the base layer, layer property, and rename this. The first thing you want to do is do the shadows. So you set this as a multiply. And choose a tone of gray that you want to use as shadow. You could actually choose different color, but we'll choose gray for now. I have a habit of always using this gray as a starting color. This is a Photoshop default swatch, and I always use the first gray in the second row, but you could decide what gray you want to use. So before you get started, you want to select the light source, as we talked about in the second lesson of this course. And what light source will make an interesting light and shadow, in the second lesson of this course. And what light source will make an interesting light and shadow. For this one, I think I'm going to go with a light that's coming from the top right down, a little bit in front of the character perhaps. And you start cel shading, and instead of describing with words, I'm going to exactly just demonstrate it directly. Since the light is coming from this side, this part of the hair would be in shadow, and I just push F2. The fun thing about it, you can always add chunks to it as you go. You don't have to select all the shadow area and then fill it all at once. You know that the light's hitting in this area of the hair, so this part might be in shadow. And don't worry if you make mistakes or create areas where the shadow doesn't look right. Cel shading actually is simple in terms of technicalities, but knowing where to put the right shadow actually takes practice. And that's basically the key part about a good cel shading and bad cel shading, is if the shadow is placed at the correct area. And then because right now you're basically selecting shadow, like I mentioned earlier, when you're doing a shadow, you're basically sculpting the shape of the object. And you could, even though we have there's a line layer that we drew before, how you apply the shadow would change how the shape of the character will look like. And again, keep in mind that right now for now we're going with two-tone, so we'll just be using this gray in this one layer first. Whether or not we take it to three-tone cel shading or two-tone, we can always decide later and just render it as is for now. Again, practice with where you put the shadow, and because we are only using two-tone, it's actually sometimes quite hard to find the exact correct place to do the defining shadow. You have to put the shadow at a place that is consistent with the lighting, but at the same time define the shape of the object by just using a very simple line. With cel shading, you can also see that how the importance of light and shadow, and how just by the simple line that we did right here, it right away determined the shape of the face perhaps even more than the line art itself. Good practice sometimes is if you want to learn about practice where to put the shadow for cell shading. Just look around you, look for pictures on the internet where there's a picture that has strong contrast, and just perhaps squint your lines and try to understand where the shadow is, and if you squint your eyes at pictures, you see that there is somewhat of a line that happens when you're that will help you practice where to apply the shadow in cell shading. Again, this part, because it's underneath his arm, it's covering the light. And here we go. The more you do, the more you practice cell shading, the faster you'll get with determining where exactly the shadow is. Just remember the things that we talked about in lesson 2, the light and shadow, and apply it to the same thing that we talked about, apply it to cell shading as well. If our area's in shadow, don't like add light area to it just because it'll make just as if it's hitting from a different light source. And